Hi, my name's Sarah Grady, and for the P1 assignment, I'll be using the Forrester, Miller, and Davis ethical decision-making model. So I'll be identifying the problem, applying the ACA Code of Ethics, determining the nature and dimension of the dilemma, generating, potential courses of action, at least two, and then considering the potential consequences of all options and determine a course of action, evaluate the selected course of action, and implementing the course of action. So a couple of things before I get into the segments, I'd like to discuss worldview and contextual features. So my client, I'm just going to call him Justin, is a young Black male. Culturally, there's often, bias against his race due to stigma of like an angry Black man or violent crimes. So this makes me need to be aware just of any cultural differences between the two of us, especially since I'm a white woman. As well as any like judgment or stigmas that, he may feel threatened by or I may feel threatened by. And then additionally, just as a corrections officer, historically, they've kind of been characterized as sometimes acting irrationally or too quickly. And, this is something that I just need to be aware of and avoid using language that may be offensive to him, either as a Black man or a corrections officer. It's just important to, proceed with caution. Timestamp segment one, ethical issue recognition, 1 minute and 22 seconds. So I need to determine if I have an ethical obligation to report Justin for a potential threat to himself or to others. And if that's happened in the scenario, also I need to consider ethical versus legal obligations in the state of Texas, and how to appropriately handle this situation with Justin within the next 22 minutes left in our session. So, Justin, thank you for telling me this information. My obligation to protect you and others who I think may be in harm's way makes this situation complex in the state of Texas. You're living with your brother, and your frustrations with your occupation as a correctional officer, have the potential to escalate things quickly. And so that concerns me. I want to know that I know that you'd like to move on, and that you say that you're just tired and you didn't mean anything. But between the escalating fighting and between you and your brother, the workplace stressors, and then your mention of the firearm, it just makes me curious to ask a few more questions. I just want to make sure that you're doing okay, and I want to protect you the best that I can. And I want you to understand that, I won't do anything before discussing it with you today in this session. So I'd like to ask you, you said you have access to a personal firearm at home. I'm curious what made you disclose this information. Do you feel like you'd ever harm your brother with this firearm? Do you feel like you'd ever harm yourself with this firearm? Um, and then you also made the comment, I just wish everyone would leave me alone permanently. So how does that look for you? In counseling, we have this question, it's called the miracle question. And if you were to wake up tomorrow and everything were just to magically be fixed, what would that look like for you? At this time, if I felt like Justa was making statements of, suicidal ideations or anything like that, then I would do a suicide assessment screener. So the 6 questions CSSRS. And then we would discuss, we'd go through each of those questions. If I felt like he was a moderate to high risk, then I would continue with the long form suicide risk assessment, the CSSRS, but the long form so I could better understand the situation and the risk there. Um, who would be affected by this? How would Justin as a client be affected by this? His brother could be affected, his mom, the family, me as a counselor, my supervisor, my, agency, potentially law enforcement, or the corrections facility where he works at. We all have the potential to be affected by this, either through not handling the situation appropriately, through Justin or his brother harming each other or something like that. So, those are all things to consider. Timestamp segment two, decision, justification, and reasoning, 4 minutes and 24 seconds. So foundational ethical principles are supported by the client's choosing, to decide which appropriate steps to take next. So, Justin, we're going to discuss removing the weapon from the home and if there's a safe place or a person that he can leave it with until things kind of cool down. So that provides him the autonomy to kind of help make those decisions for himself, and how to move forward. Justice is supported by, making sure that I discuss confidentiality and limits to confidentiality just across all clients, ensuring that they all understand my responsibilities as a counselor and then their rights as a client. And then beneficence is supported through early intervention with the firearm. So, working together to ensure that the client and everyone else is safe is in the client's best interest. Non-malfeasance requires me to do no harm to my client. And in this scenario, that could mean reporting too early could cause undue harm to my client. When there's an immediate threat that has not been made, um, reporting prematurely could, cause a chain of events that could lead to him being harmed or, unreasonably discharged from work or his home. So something to be cautious of. Fidelity with my client in protecting the therapist-client relationship and not losing trust with the client through premature action. Discussing thoroughly with him what each step that we're going to move forward with is, so he isn't feeling caught off guard any step of the way. And then lastly, veracity requires that, I act ethically by, being honest and professional with Justin, making sure that he understands all the potential consequences of his actions and the plan that we will set into place. So discussing the firearm and the potential risk that it carries with Justin, I would ask, do you think that if you ever felt threatened by your brother or anyone else that you would use the firearm? Do you have a family member or a place at work that you could keep your firearm temporarily until it's secured, or until you feel like, the increasing frustration has subsided? Um, if he states that he feels safer having a firearm close, I understand that. But, if I feel that you could be an immediate threat to yourself or to anyone else, that would change this conversation a little bit. So can you call me and let me know when you've secured the firearm away from the home? The Texas Health and Safety Code, Chapter 611.002 states confidentiality of information and prohibition against disclosure, states that, communication between a patient and professional are confidential. Chapter 611.004 states that, exceptions to confidentiality allows me to tell, but does not legally require me to tell. And if I do disclose that information, it would be to law enforcement or medical personnel. So the TAC, the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 681.45, supports confidentiality and required reporting, stating that, you must not disclose communication unless permitted by Chapter 611. And then the ACA Code of Ethics, A to B, discusses types of information needed, stating that clients have the right to confidentiality and must be provided with an explanation to the limits of that confidentiality. Justin didn't ask, but it's my duty to let him know. So B2A suggests that, serious and foreseeable harm and legal requirement states that general um, requirement that counselors keep information confidential does not apply when disclosure is required to protect clients or identified others from serious and foreseeable harm. And then it also states that, counselors consult with other professionals when in doubt at the validity, to the validity of, an exception. Justin has not identified anybody as potentially harming them. And so this is where I struggled a little bit before I understand the Texas code, that said that we are not required, that Texas protects confidentiality over disclosure. So then, B7A, respect for privacy, just states that information shared in a counseling relationship is discussed for professional purposes only, and that every effort is made to protect the client's identity and avoid undue invasion of privacy. So again, kind of protects me whenever it comes to consulting with professionals. So let's discuss, you and your brother's relationship and the living situation. Can you move out? Can your brother move out? What is keeping you from changing your living situation? If you feel it's not productive or healthy, is this a socioeconomic issue, financial, otherwise? And how can we help you with that? How would your family feel about this situation? Do you have a support system to lean on that you could temporarily stay with a family member or a friend? Timestamp segment 3, action planning, 9 minutes and 35 seconds. So I have two potential action plans. The first one is my favorite, or the one I'm leaning towards. So option one, I would discuss the statements that the client made with him in session in real time, to gain a deeper understanding of his intended use of the firearm. And then I would ask him if he would harm himself or his brother. If he gives me any indication that he would harm himself, immediately perform a suicide risk assessment screener, the six question CSSRS. And then if he indicates, moderate to high risk for suicidal ideation, performing the long form suicide risk assessment. And then discussing a safety plan, storing the firearm elsewhere, talking to the client about seeking inpatient treatment and the risks and consequences of not seeking inpatient care if I felt that he was high risk for self harm. And then, what. This may result in me having to inform, law enforcement if I feel that he's a threat to others, and he refuses to seek treatment or aid. So then, talking with the client about storing the firearm outside of the home. So if things escalate, the firearm would not be easily accessible. And then, can you store it at a trusted relative's home or at work? Since she mentioned that it's a personal firearm, but used for work related reasons. So then I would want to follow up with the client within 48 hours to ensure that he has moved the firearm to a safe location, and be sure to set up a follow-up appointment with the client within a week so that I can check in with him. Also, I would discuss if I hadn't heard from him in 48 to 72 hours that I would attempt to reach out to him. If I didn't hear anything back, that I would call law enforcement to do a welfare check. Now, this does open me up for potential ethical or litigation here, because, if law enforcement were to go do a welfare check and the brother were to answer the door, would they inform him? The counselor required us, or the counselor called and asked us to do a welfare check. There's some, potential liability there. So that's something to be aware of. But again, discussing this with Justin ahead of time so he knows, that I would be contacting law enforcement, and so we have discussed that. Documenting everything in the client file. So making sure that I had the action plan, what we discussed, what the next steps were, all of that. And then consulting with a trusted, colleague or supervisor to ensure that I've taken all the appropriate steps to ensure safety of the client and others immediately after, or at least within 24 hours after the session has ended with Justin. If I can't get a solid answer, still feel unsure, I could reach out to law enforcement without identifying, Justin, or giving any potential identifiers, just to make sure that I am understanding expectations for me as a counselor within the Texas law. So that way, I could provide a hypothetical situation without identifying Justin. So I feel like this action plan, why I'm leaning towards it is because, it ensures that the client and his brother are safe, and that I, as the therapist, have addressed, any homicidal or suicidal ideations, and that he may be exploring. Ethically, I've not violated the client's confidentiality, and I've identified and minimized any risk of any potential litigation through appropriate action with the client. I've also consulted with a professional colleague, to ensure that I have followed all appropriate ethical and legal steps to ensure the client and others' safety. So my second option, is what I feel like is the least ethical and legally permissive action plan. So I suggest that, inform the client that I have an ethical obligation to report any potential harm or threat to himself or others, only considering the ethical standard and not the Texas Health and Safety Code, Chapter 611. So reporting the client to law enforcement, that there could be a potential threat. Law enforcement would likely not do much. They would say, call us back if there's an immediate threat. Or if they chose to do a follow up before an immediate threat is made, they could potentially alert the brother, if he were to answer the door, and the brother could get angry, or want to handle things, before his brother could. So, then the client could become angry with me, that I informed law enforcement and I broke confidentiality because he didn't make a direct threat. He could report me to the LPC board and also file a civil suit against me. His workplace could find out about the reporting and could put him on leave or require that he go undergo a psych evaluation before continuing work. His brother could find out about the reporting and kind of have a, I'm going to get him before he gets me kind of attitude. And that again would open me up to litigation and could potentially lead to horrible um, consequences, direct harm, or even potentially the death of my client. The firm that I work for or the person that I sought consultation with could also be potentially brought into litigation for my mishandling of any ethical and legal situation. So again, this is my least least favorite plan. Ideally, I would go with action plan one. Thank you.